The courtroom air was thick with contempt, and every bit of it was aimed at Evelyn Vance. Her simple second-hand dress seemed to shrink under the weight of a dozen judgmental stares. Across the room, her ex-husband, Julian Thorne, sat beside his new fiancée, a woman draped in diamonds and disdain. They were there to finalize a divorce, but for them it was a victory lap. They were about to paint Evelyn as a worthless, leeching spouse who deserved nothing. Julian's lawyer was a shark circling, ready to tear her apart in front of the judge. What could be more humiliating than being publicly destroyed by the man you once built a life with? They thought they knew everything about the quiet, timid woman they were casting aside. They were about to learn how devastatingly wrong they were. The sterile chill of courtroom 4B clung to Evelyn Vance's skin. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning and everything to do with the palpable scorn directed at her. She sat alone at the respondents' table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Her lawyer, a young and earnest but visibly overwhelmed public defender named Sarah Jenkins, shuffled papers beside her, the rustling sound amplifying the silence. Across the aisle was the source of her current misery. Julian Thorne, her soon-to-be ex-husband, looked every bit the man of success she had helped him become. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, its dark charcoal fabric a testament to a world she was no longer a part of. Beside him, his fiancée, Isabella Sterling, was a portrait of condescending perfection. Her blonde hair was styled in a severe, elegant chignon, her pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light, and a smug little smile played on her lips as she occasionally leaned over to whisper in Julian's ear. They looked like a power couple on the cover of a business magazine. Evelyn, in her $15 thrift store dress, felt like a ghost, haunting their triumph. "Your Honor," began Marcus Finch, Julian's lawyer. He was a man whose expensive cologne preceded him, a slick, silver-haired predator with a voice as smooth and dangerous as black ice. "We are here today to dissolve the marriage between my client, Mr. Julian Thorne, and the respondent, Ms. Evelyn Vance. But more specifically, we are here to address Ms. Vance's utterly baseless and frankly insulting claim for spousal support." Finch paced before the judge's bench, his movements theatrical and confident. Mr. Thorne, through sheer brilliance and relentless hard work, has built a successful boutique investment firm, Thorne Capital. He is a pillar of the financial community. Ms. Vance, on the other hand, he paused, turning to gesture dismissively at Evelyn, contributed nothing. In the 5 years of their marriage, she held a series of menial part-time jobs. A barista here, a bookstore clerk there, never showing any ambition, any drive. She was, to be blunt, a domestic anchor on a man destined for the stratosphere. Evelyn flinched as if struck. A domestic anchor. Was that what she was? She thought of the countless nights she'd worked double shifts at the diner, the scent of grease clinging to her hair so Julian could afford the subscription to the Wall Street Journal and the data terminals he needed. She remembered selling her late mother's locket, the only piece of real jewelry she owned, to pay for the deposit on his first office space. He'd called her his angel investor then, kissing her hands and promising her the world. "Furthermore," Finch continued, his voice dripping with theatrical pity, "Ms. Vance has made no effort to become self-sufficient since their separation 6 months ago. She lives in a run-down apartment, works minimal hours at a local library, and seems to expect my client, a man she emotionally abandoned long ago, to fund her unambitious lifestyle indefinitely. It is not just unreasonable, Your Honor, it is parasitic." Isabella Sterling let out a soft, delicate scoff just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. She glanced at Julian, who refused to meet her eyes, instead staring at the judge with a look of pained sincerity. He was playing the victim, the magnanimous genius held back by a simple, grasping woman. "We have bank statements, employment records," Finch said, slapping a folder onto the clerk's desk. "They will show a woman content with mediocrity while my client built an empire. To award her alimony would be to reward indolence. We propose a one-time settlement of $5,000, a generous offer to help her get on her feet, and nothing more. $5,000 for 5 years of her life, for sacrificing her own dreams, for believing in his. A bitter laugh almost escaped Evelyn's lips. It was less than the cost of the watch on Isabella's wrist. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, peered down at Evelyn over her glasses. Miss Vance, your lawyer's initial filing requested 50% of all assets acquired during the marriage and ongoing alimony of $10,000 a month. Mr. Finch presents a very different picture of your contributions. Do you have a response? Evelyn's throat felt like it was filled with sand. All eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their belief that she was exactly what Finch had painted her to be. A pathetic failure clinging to a successful man's coattails. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins began, her voice a little shaky. My client supported Mr. Thorne emotionally and financially in the early years. Her income, while modest, paid for their living expenses, while Mr. Thorne's business was still a concept. Finch laughed, a short barking sound. Objection, Your Honor, vague and unsubstantiated. Does she have receipts for the groceries she bought? A ledger for every cup of coffee. This is the desperate grasping of a woman who realizes she let a winning lottery ticket slip through her fingers. The small gallery, mostly composed of Julian and Isabella's friends, tittered with amusement. Julian finally chanced to look at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. It was the look you give a stray dog you have to shoo away from your pristine porch. That look, more than anything Finch had said, broke something inside Evelyn. The dam of quiet suffering she had maintained for months finally cracked. She took a slow, deep breath. The cold courtroom air a shock to her lungs. The fear and shame that had paralyzed her began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted to know about her finances. They wanted to talk about what she was owed. Fine. It was time to stop playing by their rules. She leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer. Sarah Jenkins' eyes widened in shock, then confusion, then a dawning, electrifying understanding. She straightened up, her entire demeanor changing from that of a nervous rookie to a confident professional. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice, now clear and strong, cutting through the murmurs in the room. We withdraw our previous request. It is, as Mr. Finch so crudely pointed out, inadequate. Finch smirked. Finally, some sense. So you'll be accepting my client's generous offer? No, Sarah said, looking directly at him. We will be filing a new motion, a motion to dismiss the need for any spousal support whatsoever. My client has no need for Mr. Thorne's money. However, we will be seeking reimbursement for a number of personal assets left in the marital home. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Assets valued conservatively at approximately $25 million. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Marcus Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. Julian and Isabella stared, their faces masks of pure disbelief. $25 million. From the woman in the cheap dress, the game had just changed, and Evelyn Vance was finally ready to play. The memory was so vivid, it felt like yesterday. It was raining, a relentless New York City downpour that turned the streets into dark, glistening mirrors. They were huddled in their tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, the one with the rattling radiator and the window that never quite closed. Evelyn had just come home from a 12-hour shift at the Daily Grind, a coffee shop where she was a star barista, her hands aching and smelling faintly of burnt espresso. Julian was at their rickety dining table, which was buried under a mountain of papers, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. He hadn't even noticed she'd come in. That was common in those days. His mind was always miles away, lost in the intricate world of algorithms, market trends, and financial projections. "Jules," she had said softly, placing a paper bag on the one clear corner of the table. "I brought you a sandwich, the pastrami you like." He looked up, his eyes unfocused for a moment before recognition dawned. "Oh, Ellie. Hey, I didn't hear you." He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "I think I'm onto something. A predictive algorithm for micro-cap stocks. It's revolutionary." She had smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of his infectious passion. This was the Julian she had fallen in love with. The brilliant, driven dreamer who saw patterns in the chaos of the world that no one else could. He wasn't Julian Thorne, the future CEO then. He was just Jules, the boy with a dream too big for their tiny apartment. "That's amazing," she said, unwrapping the sandwich for him. "Eat something. You've been at this for 2 days straight." He took a bite, chewing absently. "The server costs are going to be insane to backtest this properly, and I need a Bloomberg terminal subscription. That's $2,000 a month, Ellie." $2,000, he sighed, the weight of his ambition pressing down on him. "It's impossible." Evelyn looked around their apartment. Every piece of furniture was second-hand. Every dish was chipped. Her clothes were from clearance racks. Her one luxury, a new book every month. All their money, every spare dollar from her job and his occasional freelance coding gigs, went into a savings account labeled The Dream. But it wasn't enough. The next day, she took the subway to a small, dusty pawn shop in the Diamond District. In her pocket was a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate gold locket, intricately carved with forget-me-nots. It had been her mother's, given to her on her 16th birthday. It was the most precious thing she owned, a tangible link to a past she rarely spoke of. She walked out an hour later with $2,500 in cash, enough for the subscription and a little extra. When she gave the money to Julian that night, he was ecstatic. "Ellie, how? Where did you get this?" "I have my ways," she'd said with a breezy smile, tucking the memory of the gruff pawnbroker and the ache in her heart into a deep, hidden corner. "Call me your angel investor." He had lifted her off her feet, spinning, her around their tiny living room. "When Thorne Capital is a reality, I'll buy you 1,000 lockets. I'll buy you a diamond for every coffee you've ever served. I promise, Ellie. It's all for us." For us? That had been the mantra. The sacrifices piled up, each one a brick in the foundation of his success. She took on extra shifts, becoming a waitress at night after her barista job. She learned to patch his suits, to cook gourmet-tasting meals on a shoestring budget for the potential investors he'd bring over. She was his sounding board, his cheerleader, his unpaid assistant, and the silent, steady engine that kept his life running while he focused solely on the dream. The day Thorne Capital secured its first round of major funding was the best day of their lives. He came home, lifted her up in that same way, and they drank champagne, real expensive champagne, out of their mismatched coffee mugs. The future felt limitless. But success, Evelyn learned, was a corrosive acid. The more successful Julian became, the more the us began to feel like him. Their tiny apartment was traded for a sleek, minimalist condo overlooking Central Park. Her thrift store clothes were replaced by designer outfits he'd pick out, telling her she needed to look the part. The brilliant, passionate dreamer was slowly being replaced by a polished, calculating stranger. He began to criticize her, her lack of a prestigious degree, her simple hobbies of reading and gardening on their small balcony. Her friends, who were nurses and teachers, not hedge fund managers and socialites. "Ellie, you're not even trying," he'd say, frustrated after a networking event where she'd spent most of her time talking to the catering staff. "These people are important. You need to engage." She had tried, but she felt like a fraud in that world of fake smiles and transactional conversations. It wasn't her. The more he pushed her to be someone else, the more she retreated into herself. Then came Isabella Sterling. Her father ran a competing older firm, A union between Julian and Isabella was more than a marriage. It was a merger. Evelyn first saw them together in a photo in a society column. Julian had his arm around Isabella's waist at a charity gala he told Evelyn he was attending with his lawyer. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. The confrontation was cold and clinical. It didn't happen in their home, but in a neutral, sterile coffee shop. A cruel irony that wasn't lost on Evelyn. "It's not working, Evelyn," he said, not even looking at her, stirring a sugar he didn't take into his black coffee. "We want different things. I've outgrown this. We've outgrown this." "You mean you found someone more useful?" she said, her voice quiet, devoid of the tears he was clearly expecting. His eyes flickered with annoyance. "That's a crude way of putting it. Isabella understands my world. She's a part of it." You were for the beginning. I'll always be grateful for that. But this is the big leagues now." He slid a piece of paper across the table. A separation agreement. The terms were insulting. He was effectively erasing her, turning 5 years of her life into a footnote. "I'll be generous," he'd said, the words a slap in the face. "I won't let you be destitute." Looking back now from the cold vantage point of the courtroom, Evelyn understood. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to retroactively invalidate their entire history. He needed to believe that he had done it all himself, that she was nothing more than a temporary phase, a piece of scaffolding to be kicked away once the skyscraper was built. By painting her as a lazy, unambitious parasite, he wasn't just trying to save money, he was trying to save his own story, rewriting it with himself as the solitary hero. And for that lie, he needed to humiliate her. He needed to make her small so he could feel big. The silence in courtroom 4B was a physical entity. It pressed in on them, thick and heavy. Marcus Finch's face, usually a mask of smug control, had cycled through confusion, disbelief, and was now settling on outright fury. $25 million, Finch finally sputtered, turning to the judge as if she were his ally. "Your Honor, this is absurd. It's a desperate, ludicrous tactic. What assets is she possibly referring to? A collection of used books and chipped coffee mugs?" Judge Miller, however, was no longer looking at Finch. Her gaze was fixed on Sarah Jenkins, and for the first time a flicker of genuine interest lit her tired eyes. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said, her voice dangerously level, "you've made an extraordinary claim. I trust you are prepared to substantiate it. This court does not appreciate theatrics." "We are, Your Honor," Sarah said, her newfound confidence radiating from her. She opened a thin file folder, one that had been sitting on her desk, ignored all morning. "During their marriage, Mr. Thorne and my client resided at 113 Central Park West, apartment 14A. When my client vacated the premises following their separation, she left behind several personal items she was unable to transport at the time." She slid a document across the table. "This is a preliminary inventory. The first item is a painting that was hung in the main living area. It's a piece by Jean-Michel Basquiat titled Untitled Cadmium." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Even Julian looked confused, his brow furrowed. He glanced at Isabella, who simply shrugged, a look of bored annoyance on her face. Finch let out a derisive snort. "A Basquiat, Your Honor. They had a print, a poster they bought online for $50 and had framed. Is this a joke?" "My client is not referring to a print," Sarah stated calmly. "She is referring to the original 1984 acrylic and oil stick on canvas. It was a gift to my client on her 18th birthday." Julian actually laughed out loud this time. "That's insane. Evelyn owned a Basquiat. Her father was a high school history teacher and her mother was a librarian. They lived in a suburb in Ohio. Where would she possibly get a multi-million-dollar painting?" He turned to the judge, spreading his hands in a gesture of utter bewilderment. "Your Honor, see what I'm dealing with? She's delusional." Evelyn watched him, her expression unreadable. She let him talk. She let him dig his own grave. He was so convinced of the narrative he had built of her simple, unremarkable past that he couldn't see the truth, even as it began to assemble itself right in front of him. "The second item," Sarah continued undeterred, "is a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime watch, reference 6300G. It was kept in a safe in the master bedroom closet. Mr. Thorne was aware of the safe, though he was never given the combination." Julian's face went pale. He remembered the safe. It had been installed when they moved in. Evelyn had told him it was for sentimental documents. He'd found it odd, but he'd been too busy with the firm to question it. He'd just assumed it held old family photos and letters. A Patek Philippe, the most complicated and expensive wristwatch in the world. He felt a cold knot of dread begin to form in his stomach. "And the third item," Sarah said, her voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, "is a set of bearer bonds issued by the United States Treasury with a face value of $10 million. They were stored in the same safe." The courtroom erupted. Finch was on his feet, shouting, "Your Honor, this is a fabrication, a fantasy. She's inventing a treasure chest to extort my client. We demand proof, provenance, documentation." "We have it," Sarah said simply. She pulled out another document. "This is a notarized statement from the executor of my client's family estate, along with insurance riders for the specified items, all under the name Evelyn Vance Blackwood." The name landed in the room like a grenade. Blackwood. Not a common name, but in the circles Julian and Isabella now moved in, it was a name spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty or gods. It was the name associated with Blackwood Industries, the reclusive multinational conglomerate with interests in everything from shipping to aerospace to rare earth minerals. It was a name synonymous with old money, immense power, and impenetrable privacy. Isabella Sterling gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted from Sarah to Evelyn. She was finally looking at Evelyn, truly seeing her for the first time. The cheap dress, the quiet demeanor, it all suddenly seemed like a costume, a deliberate disguise. Julian was frozen, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. Blackwood, Evelyn Vance Blackwood. He remembered her talking about her father, how they were estranged. She'd said he was a difficult man who disapproved of her choices. Julian had pictured a stubborn small-town teacher who wanted his daughter to marry a local boy, not a brilliant financier. He'd never once asked for her father's name. It had seemed so unimportant, a relic from a past she and he had left behind. "Blackwood," Finch repeated, his voice suddenly weak, the bluster gone. "As in Alexander Blackwood." "The very same," Sarah confirmed. "Evelyn is his only child, his sole heir. She chose to live under her mother's maiden name, Vance, to live a normal life, to find a partner who would love her for who she was, not for the name she carried." Sarah's eyes met Julian's, and her gaze was filled with ice. A regrettable and clearly failed experiment. The truth slammed into Julian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a lie. It was an entire universe of deceit he had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to notice. Evelyn, the simple girl. Evelyn, the barista. Evelyn, the domestic anchor. It had all been a choice. Her sacrifice wasn't selling a locket. Her sacrifice was giving up a life of unimaginable luxury to be with him, to believe in him, and he had thrown it all away. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, the woman he had called parasitic, unambitious and delusional. She sat there, poised and calm, her expression not of triumph, but of a deep, profound sorrow, the sorrow of a woman who had gambled her heart on a man and lost in the most spectacular way possible. In that moment, Julian Thorne didn't just see the heiress to the Blackwood fortune. He saw the greatest mistake of his entire life, the winning lottery ticket he hadn't just let slip through his fingers. He had torn it to shreds and thrown it in the face of the woman who handed it to him. Isabella was already inching her chair away from him, her face a mask of horror and calculation. She wasn't looking at a fiancé anymore. She was looking at the stupidest man in the world. The courtroom was in a state of suspended animation, caught in the aftershock of the name Blackwood. Judge Miller, for her part, had regained her composure with the practiced ease of a woman who had seen every form of human drama. She banged her gavel once, the sharp crack echoing in the stunned silence. "Order," she commanded. "Mr. Finch, sit down. Miss Jenkins, you have made a claim that changes the entire nature of these proceedings. You mentioned an executor, you mentioned documentation, but in a case this unusual, the court will require more." Marcus Finch, seeing a sliver of opportunity, scrambled to his feet again. "Exactly, Your Honor. This is hearsay. Papers can be forged. Stories can be invented. They have to produce more than a name. They have to produce a person. Where is this mythical Alexander Blackwood? Why isn't he here to confirm this preposterous story?" It was a valid point. Alexander Blackwood was notoriously private, a veritable ghost who hadn't been photographed in public for over 2 decades. The idea of him appearing in a divorce court in Lower Manhattan was laughable. Finch knew it, and a bit of his swagger returned. He was betting it was all a bluff, an incredibly audacious one, but a bluff nonetheless. Sarah Jenkins didn't flinch. She glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall, then towards the heavy oak doors at the back. "My client's father is currently on a transoceanic flight and cannot be reached. His privacy is, as Mr. Finch knows, of paramount importance. However," she said, her timing impeccable, "we were prepared for the court's need for direct verification. We have a witness." "A witness?" the judge asked, her eyebrows raised. "Your witness list was submitted last week. It contained only one name, Evelyn Vance." "This is an unscheduled character and financial witness, Your Honor," Sarah admitted. "But their testimony is vital to corroborate my client's identity and financial standing, a matter which the petitioner's counsel has aggressively and repeatedly called into question. Given the circumstances, we believe their testimony is essential for justice to be served." Finch was livid. "Objection. This is a procedural ambush. We have had no time to prepare, no opportunity for discovery on this mystery witness. This is a complete violation of protocol." "Ordinarily, Mr. Finch, I would agree with you," Judge Miller said, her tone sharp. "However, you are the one who spent the last hour painting Ms. Vance as a destitute liar. You opened this door. You demanded proof. Ms. Jenkins is offering to provide it. I'm going to allow it." But she warned Sarah, this had better be substantive. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said with a respectful nod. She turned toward the back of the room. "The defense calls Arthur Pendleton to the stand." If the name Blackwood was a grenade, Arthur Pendleton was a precision-guided missile. To the average person, the name meant nothing. But in the rarefied air of global finance and corporate law, the world Julian and Finch inhabited, Arthur Pendleton was a legend. He was the CEO of the Blackwood Industries parent company, the public face of the invisible empire. He was Alexander Blackwood's right hand, his gatekeeper, and his most trusted advisor for over 30 years. They called him the Viceroy. Julian's blood ran cold. He had seen Pendleton speak once at a Davos summit he'd paid a fortune to attend. The man exuded an aura of quiet, unassailable power that made brash new money players like Julian feel like children. The idea of Arthur Pendleton walking into this courtroom on behalf of Evelyn was impossible. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 men in dark, severe suits entered first, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. They were clearly security. And then between them walked Arthur Pendleton. He was in his late 60s, tall and wiry, with a full head of silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wasn't dressed in the flashy style of lawyers like Finch. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored grey suit, a white shirt, and a dark blue tie. His clothes didn't shout money. They whispered it from a great and inaccessible distance. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace down the central aisle, his gaze fixed forward. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with his presence. He passed Julian's table without a flicker of acknowledgement. Julian felt an involuntary urge to shrink in his seat, to become invisible. Pendleton's very existence in this room was a verdict on Julian's life, a judgment far more potent than any the judge could deliver. He had not just divorced a woman, he had insulted an empire. Arthur Pendleton reached the witness stand and stood patiently, waiting to be sworn in. He looked at Evelyn, and for a single fleeting moment, his stern expression softened into one of paternal affection and concern. It was a look that confirmed everything. Marcus Finch sank into his chair, his face ashen. All the fight had gone out of him. He was a shark, yes, but he had just discovered that he was swimming in an ocean that belonged to a blue whale, and he had made the fatal mistake of trying to bite it. Isabella Sterling slowly, deliberately picked up her crocodile leather handbag from the floor. She placed it in her lap and opened it, her movements precise and mechanical. She was no longer looking at anyone. She was calculating her escape. The merger was off. The court clerk, a man who had seen decades of mundane disputes, fumbled slightly as he administered the oath to Arthur Pendleton. The witness's quiet gravitas seemed to unnerve even him. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Pendleton replied, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. Sarah Jenkins approached the stand. "Mr. Pendleton, could you please state your full name and occupation for the court?" "My name is Arthur Hemmings Pendleton. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Global Industries." Each word was delivered with precision, a statement of irrefutable fact. "And in what capacity do you know my client, Ms. Evelyn Vance?" Pendleton turned his gaze slightly to look at Evelyn, a fond, almost sad smile touching his lips for an instant. "I have known Evelyn since the day she was born. I am her godfather, and I am the executor of her family's trust." Sarah nodded. "Can you confirm for the court her relationship to your employer, Mr. Alexander Blackwood?" "Evelyn is Mr. Blackwood's only child and sole heir," Pendleton stated simply. "Her legal name is Evelyn Vance Blackwood. Vance was her mother's name. After her mother's passing and upon entering adulthood, Evelyn made a personal decision to use the name Vance exclusively in her public life. It was a choice born of a desire for privacy and normalcy, a choice her father, though he may not have fully understood it, begrudgingly respected. Finch, seeing his career flashing before his eyes, knew he had to do something, anything. He weakly rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is all very touching, but it's not relevant to the division of marital assets." Judge Miller glared at him. "Mr. Finch, you spent the better part of an hour arguing that Ms. Vance's financial standing was zero and that her character was that of a common grifter. This testimony speaks directly to both of those assertions." Overruled. "Sit down." Finch sat, his face burning with humiliation. Sarah continued. "Mr. Pendleton, we have submitted an inventory of 3 specific items: a Basquiat painting, a Patek Philippe watch, and a series of bearer bonds, which my client claims are her personal, non-marital property. Can you speak to the authenticity of these claims?" "I certainly can," Pendleton said. "The Basquiat, untitled cadmium, was purchased by Mr. Blackwood at a Sotheby's auction in 2015. It was a gift for Evelyn's 18th birthday. I personally oversaw the acquisition and the drafting of the deed of gift. It is her sole property. Its last appraisal valued it at $17 million. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. $17 million for one painting. Julian felt dizzy. The numbers were so large, they were almost meaningless. He remembered that painting. It had hung over their sofa. He'd always thought it was a chaotic, ugly mess. He'd once joked about replacing it with something more soothing. Evelyn had just given him a strange, sad look and changed the subject. The Patek Philippe, Pendleton continued, his tone as even as if he were reading a grocery list, was also a gift from me, actually, for her graduation from Columbia University. It is one of only 7 in existence. Its value is approximately $3.5 million. Julian's mind reeled. Columbia. Evelyn had told him she had a simple state college degree. Another lie. A lie to make herself seem smaller, less intimidating, more like him. The generosity of her deception was, in its own way, more devastating than the wealth itself. "And the bearer bonds," Sarah prompted. "Those were placed in a trust for Evelyn by her late mother, Catherine Vance Blackwood. They were intended as an emergency fund for Evelyn, to be kept entirely separate from the Blackwood family finances, to give her a measure of independence. I can confirm their face value is $10 million. All of these items predate her marriage to Mr. Thorne by several years. They are unequivocally her personal property." Pendleton paused, then shifted his gaze, pinning Julian Thorne with a look as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Your Honor, if I may add a personal observation," Pendleton said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "For the past 6 years, I have watched Evelyn live a life of profound modesty. She has done so to test a hypothesis that she could find a partner who valued her spirit, her intelligence, and her heart above all else. She actively hid a personal fortune that dwarfs Mr. Thorne's entire company, not out of deceit, but out of hope. She worked grueling, thankless jobs, not because she had to, but to support the man she loved, to allow his dream to flourish. She contributed every dollar she earned and every ounce of her energy to their partnership." He let the words sink in. "The accusation I heard upon entering this courtroom, that she was a parasite, an anchor, a woman of no ambition, is not only a grotesque falsehood, but the single greatest misjudgment of character I have ever witnessed in my 68 years. Mr. Thorne did not have a leech for a wife. He had a benefactor of unimaginable generosity. He was a man who was handed the keys to a kingdom, and instead of entering, he complained about the weight of the keys and threw them away for a handful of shiny pebbles." The metaphor, delivered in Pendleton's devastatingly calm voice, was brutal. It stripped Julian bare, exposing his shallow ambition and catastrophic lack of perception for everyone to see. Isabella Sterling had heard enough. Quietly, without a word to Julian, she stood up. She smoothed down her dress, picked up her purse, and with the posture of a queen abandoning a fallen state, she walked calmly out of the courtroom. The soft click of the door closing behind her was the sound of Julian's future ending. Julian didn't watch her go. He couldn't take his eyes off Evelyn. She was looking at Pendleton, and her eyes were shining with unshed tears, not of sadness but of gratitude. For the first time in months, someone had spoken the truth. Someone had seen her. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins said, returning to her seat. Judge Miller looked at the shell-shocked Marcus Finch. "Mr. Finch, cross-examination." Finch looked at Pendleton, who met his gaze with unnerving calm. "Cross-examine the Viceroy of the Blackwood Empire. It would be professional suicide." "No, Your Honor," Finch mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "No questions." Judge Miller surveyed the scene before her. The petitioner's side was in disarray. Julian Thorne sat alone, a man hollowed out, the architecture of his arrogance having collapsed in on itself. His lawyer, Marcus Finch, was shuffling papers with no purpose, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The respondent's side, by contrast, was a bastion of quiet strength. "Well," the judge said, her voice laced with an irony so dry it could start a fire, "this has certainly been an illuminating morning. The court finds the testimony of Mr. Pendleton to be credible and compelling." She fixed her gaze on Julian. "Mr. Thorne, your petition to deny spousal support is of course granted, as the respondent has graciously withdrawn her request. As for the matter of the personal assets, Miss Jenkins, has your client made arrangements to retrieve her property?" "We have, Your Honor," Sarah confirmed. "Mr. Pendleton's security team is on standby. We request a court order granting my client immediate and exclusive access to the residence at 113 Central Park West for a period of 2 hours to retrieve her belongings." "So ordered," the judge said, banging her gavel. It felt less like a closing and more like a final nail being hammered into the coffin of Julian's life. And as for the petitioner's generous offer of a $5,000 settlement, she looked at Julian with utter disdain. The court dismisses that offer as insulting, made in bad faith, and based on a complete and willful misrepresentation of the facts. This proceeding is concluded. The gavel fell one last time. It was over. As people began to stir, the muted buzz of shocking gossip filling the room, Arthur Pendleton stepped down from the witness stand. He walked over to the defense table and placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and kind. Evelyn finally looked up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She nodded, managing a small, watery smile. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything." "Alexander wanted to come himself," Pendleton admitted. "I had to talk him out of it. He would have bought the courthouse and had it demolished with Mr. Thorne still inside." Despite everything, a small laugh escaped Evelyn's lips. It felt like the first ray of sunshine after a long storm. She stood, and for the first time that day, she squared her shoulders and looked across the aisle at the man who had been her husband. Julian was staring at her, his face a pathetic mask of desperation and dawning horror. As she began to walk away, flanked by Pendleton and her lawyer, he finally snapped out of his trance. "Ellie!" he called out, his voice cracking. He stumbled from his chair, rushing to intercept her before she reached the aisle. "Ellie, wait! We need to talk!" Pendleton's security men moved instantly, stepping between Julian and Evelyn, forming a silent, immovable wall. "Please," Julian begged, his voice pleading, his eyes wild with regret. "I didn't know. I swear I had no idea. I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake." Evelyn stopped. She looked at him, not over the shoulders of the security guards, but by stepping slightly to the side, meeting his gaze directly. The look in her eyes was not one of anger or hatred. It was something far worse. Pity. It was the look one gives to something broken and insignificant. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying in the now quiet courtroom. "You did make a mistake. But your mistake wasn't leaving me, and it wasn't not knowing about my family." She took a step closer, forcing him to see the profound truth of her words. "Your mistake was believing that a person's worth is measured by their bank account. You mocked me for being a barista, a librarian. You were ashamed of me because I wasn't a CEO or a socialite. You didn't see any value in kindness or loyalty or sacrifice unless it directly served your ambition." She let the silence hang for a moment. "The money doesn't change who I am. I'm still the woman who served coffee to support you. I'm still the woman who sold her mother's locket for you. The only thing that has changed is that now you see that woman as valuable. And that, Julian, is why we are over. You didn't fall in love with Evelyn Vance, and you certainly don't deserve Evelyn Blackwood." With that, she turned her back on him. She didn't look back as she walked out of the courtroom, Arthur Pendleton at her side, leaving Julian Thorne standing alone in the ruins of his own making. A desperately poor man who had, for a brief, shining moment, held all the wealth in the world in his hands and had been too blind to see it. The news of the courtroom drama spread through New York's elite circles like wildfire. The story was just too delicious. The meteoric rise and spectacular self-destruction of Julian Thorne. His firm, Thorne Capital, imploded within a week. Investors, spooked by his catastrophic lack of judgment, pulled their money out. His reputation as a brilliant visionary was replaced by a new one. The fool who divorced the Blackwood heiress. No one wanted to do business with a man who couldn't recognize a billion-dollar asset when he was married to it. He lost the condo, his business, and what few real friends he had. He tried calling Evelyn hundreds of times, but the calls went unanswered. He was a pariah, a walking cautionary tale whispered about at galas and in boardrooms. The shiny pebbles he had chosen, Isabella, status, a fleeting sense of superiority, had all turned to dust in his hands. 3 months passed. To the gossiping circles of New York's elite, the story of Julian Thorne's downfall had been a thrilling but fleeting drama. He was yesterday's news, a cautionary tale that had already been replaced by newer scandals. Evelyn Vance Blackwood had simply vanished, retreating behind the impenetrable walls that the Blackwood name afforded. Many assumed she had simply returned to a life of quiet, reclusive luxury, the brief, messy chapter of her public life now closed. They were wrong. The bomb dropped not in a society column, but on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline was stark, printed in bold, uncompromising ink. Blackwood heiress launches $500 million Vance Foundation for Educational and Arts Access. Beneath it was a photograph of Evelyn taken at a press conference held not in some sterile corporate ballroom, but in the majestic book-lined hall of the New York Public Library. She looked transformed. The timid, haunted woman from the courtroom was gone, replaced by a leader. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress, her hair cut in a sharp, professional bob. There was no ostentatious jewelry, only the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her power. Her eyes, once downcast, were now clear, focused, and held a fire that no one, least of all Julian, had ever seen before. The launch of the Vance Foundation was a meticulously planned statement. The guest list was not a Rolodex of Wall Street titans and vapid socialites. It was composed of university presidents, celebrated poets, struggling playwrights, community organizers, and public school teachers. It was a room full of the very people Julian's world considered insignificant. Her speech, delivered without notes, was a masterpiece of grace and purpose. "For a portion of my life," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "I chose to live under my mother's name, Vance. She was a librarian. My father, a man of industry, built empires of steel and commerce. But my mother built empires of the mind. She believed that access to knowledge, to art, to beauty was not a luxury, but a fundamental human right. She taught me that a person's true net worth isn't found on a balance sheet, but in the richness of their curiosity and the depth of their empathy." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the rapt audience. "The world has enough foundations dedicated to building bigger buildings. This foundation is dedicated to building bigger minds. The Vance Foundation will be dedicated to ensuring that the next great novelist isn't lost because her local library closed down, that the next scientific genius isn't overlooked because he couldn't afford tuition, and that the value of a quiet life dedicated to knowledge is celebrated, not mocked." The final line was a subtle, perfectly aimed dart, and the message was clear. This was not an act of charity, it was a reordering of values. In a subsequent rare one-on-one interview with a respected journalist, the inevitable question arose. "Your story has captivated the public," the interviewer said gently. "Many see what happened to your ex-husband as a form of cosmic revenge. Do you?" Evelyn's smile was thoughtful, devoid of malice. "I don't believe in revenge. Revenge is a conversation with the past, and I am far more interested in building the future. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about punishing Julian. It was about my own liberation. For years I allowed someone else to define my worth, to dictate my story. I made myself small to make him feel big, believing that was the nature of love and support. My mistake was in thinking that my value was something that could be diminished by someone else's opinion." She leaned forward, her sincerity palpable. "My father's name, Blackwood, provides the resources for this work. It's a tool, a powerful one. But my mother's name, Vance, provides the mission. This foundation is my voice. It's a testament to the belief that true strength isn't about how much you can acquire, but how much you can give. My story isn't about a secret heiress. It's about a librarian's daughter finally putting her mother's lessons into practice. Far across town, in a dimly lit bar in Queens that smelled of stale beer and regret, Julian Thorne watched the interview on a flickering television mounted over the counter. He was nursing a cheap whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to numb the perpetual ache in his soul. He had lost everything. His firm was a bankrupt shell. His condo had been sold to cover his debts, and his name was a punchline. He was wearing a frayed shirt, his face unshaven, the ghost of the Tom Ford-wearing titan he once was. As Evelyn spoke, every word was a fresh torment. A librarian's daughter. He remembered mocking her mother's profession, the value of a quiet life. He remembered calling her unambitious. He saw the Basquiat he'd called an ugly mess, now the cornerstone of a museum exhibit funded by her foundation. He saw the brilliant, kind and profoundly wealthy woman he had cast aside for a shallow socialite who hadn't returned a single one of his calls. He hadn't just misjudged her finances. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of value itself. His ambition had been a raging fire that had given him a brief, brilliant light before consuming him completely, leaving him as nothing but cold ash. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he had lost a universe. Evelyn, meanwhile, was miles away from any thought of him. The interview was over. The galas and press conferences were done for the day. She was at a small, underfunded community library in the Bronx, one of the first recipients of a Vance grant. There were no cameras here. She sat on a small stool in the children's section, reading a storybook to a small group of wide-eyed kids. In this quiet, unassuming space, surrounded by the smell of old paper and youthful imagination, she was truly home. She was not Evelyn Blackwood, the heiress, nor was she Evelyn Vance, the mocked ex-wife. She was simply Evelyn, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, not hardened but illuminated, finally building an empire of her own. One book, one mind, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Evelyn's journey wasn't just about revealing a secret identity. It was about revealing her true self, a self she had hidden even from herself. She walked into that courtroom a victim and walked out a victor, not because of her money, but because she finally reclaimed her own story. It's a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by someone else's opinion or their inability to see our value. It's defined by our own integrity, kindness, and the strength to stand up for who we are. What do you think was the biggest mistake Julian made? Was it his greed, his arrogance, or his simple failure to see the amazing person right in front of him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Evelyn's story of humiliation and ultimate triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more powerful real-life stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these incredible journeys to light. Thank you for watching.